We're recording. Desktop. Hello, everybody. I'm Dan Klein. I am going to speak about Adam Smith's remarkable footnote in the history of ancient logics and metaphysics. I'm doing this kind of very much by the seat of my pants, although I've studied this a good deal, thought about it a good deal. I have a lot crammed into my head at the moment. I figured, hey, maybe I should record this. With me right now are 17 other people, part of the Adam Smith reading group. So what I plan to do, I'm recording, what I plan to do is talk about this matter. Obviously, it's not the place to do serious textual consideration, but what's going on, what are the kind of angles, suspicions I have, and what are the kind of arguments and points to be fleshed out in a more scholarly form of communication. So the footnote in this essay has 3 statements in it. And the one that mostly motivates me, I'll list first and then go to these other 2. The main one, the most, in some sense, the most important one, is Smith's statement that sort of denounces esotericism. It's a quite remarkable statement. It's hard to believe to me that he really believed it. Here I've flipped now to actually a whole text of the footnote. The footnote itself is 1,337 words. It's extraordinarily long. And in the course of this, he's talking about some other thinkers that I will speak of in a second, suggesting the idea of a double doctrine in Plato, a double doctrine saying that Plato's words were intended to seem to mean one thing, while at bottom they meant a very different. And then this is really the killer statement, which the writings of no man in his senses ever were or ever could be intended to do. So those, I don't know, what is that, a dozen words? Which the writings of no man in his senses ever were or ever could be intended to do. So no man in his senses would write esoterically, he's asserting here. This is how the passage is read by numerous scholars. And I should also say that it's played up significantly by some, including the leading person in esoteric writing issues, Arthur Melzer, in his treatment of what's going on in the 18th century. He says, this is the only notable rejection or denial of esotericism. Everyone else understood it and took it for granted. So this little passage plays a huge role in Melzer's own history of esoteric writing and attitudes towards it. Now, I want to suggest that Smith didn't really believe this, and he's himself being esoteric, and he's in fact doing what he's saying right here, what he's saying no man in his senses would do. Now, let me just remark on what this means for Melzer, if I'm right. In one sense, if I were right, he should be unhappy, and in one sense, he should be happy. He should be unhappy because he himself has sort of missed the esoteric meaning, while he's like the chief, like the leading esoteric reader of the world in a way. And by the way, I don't mean to be at all facetious. I totally love Melzer's book. When I published a list of books that I recommend for 2050 readers 30 years from now. I put his book as #1 among 20th century works, 21st century works so far. And Arthur's a doll, and he's a friend, and I communicate with him a lot. So, I think he missed this. I'm inclined to say. By the way, Straussians are generally, I think, quite weak on Hume and Smith. And so this would be part of that pattern. On the other hand, he would be happy, because if I'm right, it only fortifies his historical claims about esotericism. That is, that everybody back then kind of knew about it and did it and understood it. And so there isn't even this significant counter example, which he brought up. So this is the first claim. And what is the second claim? The second claim is that the neo-Platonic reading of Plato is balderdash. The neo-Platonic reading of Plato gets into the whole matter of what Smith says Plato was saying, and then about him saying that what they said about Plato is balderdash. So what does Smith say about Plato? What does he say Plato teaches us about these matters? And basically it's like the following. Plato, this is now the official Smith version of Plato. Plato believed and taught that there is a God who does have a great mind, kind of a divine mind, okay? However, apart from him are the forms. This thing that I'm referring to with the word the forms is also sometimes called universals, species, ideas. I'm going to use the term forms just because I got to use something. So apart from the divine mind, there exists the forms, as well as, I gather, kind of the metachlorians of substance, of matter, which, you know, God can make things out of. Kind of like, I think that's also pre-existing or independently existing. And so the doctrine of Plato here is that there's the metachlorians, if you will, and there are the forms, and then God went and made the cosmos, including us and so forth. The Neoplatonic thinkers say, actually what Plato believed, he said that, but he didn't really mean it, or sometimes he suggested it, but he didn't really mean it. And what he really meant is that the forms actually are thoughts of the divine mind, and you can't really think of them as separate. Maybe they're even, the Neoplatonics are saying, in fact, they're created by the divine mind. And so this issue of whether they're creations or just thoughts that imply the thinking of the divine mind, that's a kind of subtle issue about whether or not all of our thoughts are our own creation. That gets into issues about asymmetric knowledge within a single being, including God, which actually can get us into interesting issues about the Trinity. But anyway, the Neoplatonics, therefore, are saying, no, Plato kind of knew that the forms presuppose or necessarily imply the mind that knows or sees the forms, or a mind. Kind of like, you know, if you speak of a mother, it implies a child. And if you speak of a child, it implies a parent. So they're not separate, really. They go together. And you might think of one as creation, one being the forms being the creation of the mind, but that's kind of like a further twist. That's another issue. So he says, exoterically, Smith is saying, I don't believe that Plato thought that. And that instead, you know, he just said there were these things that were separate, the forms, and if you like, the metachlorians, and then God went off and made things with those. Now, before we get to the footnote, there's two things about this presentation of Plato that I want to, Smith's presentation of Plato, that I want to note. That the first is that, by the way, so what does the human mind think? And so he goes on to explain that as far as the human mind understood any of this is in the official version of Plato, whatever idea the human mind has, this is on 123, of such things, it must derive them, the things about the forms and such, from the memory this is us now, from our memory of what it had seen in some former period of its existence, that is to say, our existence, when it had an opportunity of visiting the place or sphere of universals. So I think it's such a far-fetched, kind of crazy thing for Plato to be expounding, that we had once existed somewhere where we saw the forms and now we're born and have forgotten it. And then I think it's kind of, a little crazy for Smith to think that Plato would really seriously assert that. So I just want to note that. And then another thing, which I think is quite important and which you can see on the screen here, is that when Smith presents this official view of Plato, in the text, not the footnote, but in the proper text, he says seems to 3 times. And he goes on and he just kind of notes that this is kind of the official version. This seems to be what he means. Although some people, and then he says on 122 at the top, though this has been much controverted both by the later Platonists, that would be the neo-Platonists, and by some very judicious modern critics, and this would be like Cudworth and others, the Cambridge Platonists, who have followed the interpretation of the later Platonists as what did most honor to the judgment of that renowned philosopher, Plato. And so my point here is that in the text 3 times, he refers to there being a difference of interpretation about Plato and reading without making a fuss about it. And it says seems to, like, even kind of almost like, I'm not sure myself, what Plato really believed or was teaching. But anyway, then he's got this footnote. And in the footnote, quite to the contrary, he goes berserk against this neo-Platonic reading of Plato. Really berserk, and in a way you never ever elsewhere see Smith go. It's like, wow, what what's the matter with you, Adam? Like, so it's extremely extended, exercised, vehement, violent, and he goes off and off about this. So in this long footnote, you see here, I've got a question mark shown with red highlighting. That's the first of, I believe, 13 questions in this footnote. The next one is this very important statement. There, by the way, so just to count these, there's this question, and then there's this other statement here that's not a question, which goes to here. And then he begins this next thing, shall we suppose, which I am going to treat as a question, because shall we suppose that that great philosopher who appears to have been, no, the exoteric reading of this is that the great philosopher is Aristotle. Shall we suppose that Aristotle, who appears to have been so much superior to his master in everything but eloquence? So the exoteric reading here, and this is the third statement, exoteric statement that I challenge, Aristotle is so much superior to Plato in everything but eloquence. That's the exoteric reading here, and I'm questioning that as well. So he's saying, shall we suppose that Aristotle, so much superior in everything but eloquence, willfully and upon all occasions misrepresented the teachings of Plato when everybody had them in their hands and so on and so forth? You see, Aristotle disputes Plato on this, and he says Plato is the official view that I just set out, but I don't agree with my master on this. So Smith is saying, can we imagine that Plato meant something else and Aristotle didn't know it or understand it, what Plato was really teaching? Now, I want to suggest the esoteric reading here is that the great philosopher here is actually Plato, and the master is Socrates. And here, this makes a lot more sense, in my view. Plato, so much superior to Socrates in everything but eloquence. There's a whole bunch of reasons why I don't think it makes sense that Smith would ever say that Aristotle was so much superior to Plato in everything but eloquence. Smith is incredibly warm, I would say, towards Plato, and I'm not going to review that evidence. I think you can make a very strong case for it. In fact, some of the most signal things, like the Parmenides speaking to Plato passage, just Plato is playing a very, very important and special role here. He also talks about the divine maxims of Plato and so on. Both of those changes, by the way, come in the 6th edition of TMS. And so you have to reread this with the possibility that you can read it the other way. And in fact, while it's a little awkward because then he starts using Plato where you'd think he might use a pronoun, it's not grammatically improper. It's not grammatically improper. Now, this, as I say, I'm going to call this a question, which is then directly followed by 11 more questions. And all of those 11 questions which follow end with a question mark. However, this first in this consecutive series of 12 does not. It ends with a period. And not only that, but notice what it actually ends with. Can we imagine that Aristotle wouldn't expose such gross disingenuity on the part of his master? And so he's ending the words, he's ending this special sentence, which contains the Aristotle greater than Plato statement, with the words, such gross disingenuity. And I want to suggest that this is exactly what Smith is doing, that he's exercising, he's practicing gross disingenuity here. On this matter of, and so it's like totally ironic, and it's like esotericisms piled on top of esotericisms. These three different assertions, all of which I'm interested in questioning, are kind of like dominoes, where once you see that he's being esoteric on one, it kind of knocks over the other one to some extent, and then it goes back to undermining or subverting the very claim that esotericism is a nonsense and stupid notion to do, and only people out of their minds would do it. Now, this matter of this first question not having a question mark, you may recall from our last reading group that the final question of the astronomy is the same way. And if you recall, at the end of the astronomy, he comes to this great irony, one of the only progress of sentiments you really get in Smith, where he finds himself surprised by himself. And so this, can we wonder then that I have fallen into, essentially the gist of it is that I have fallen into talking about Newton's theories as a sort of external truth and final definitive interpretation. And it's put as a question, can we wonder then, blah, 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 but that ends too in a period. And I want to note just one more thing on this ending a question with a period rather than a question mark. There's an important question in Hume's very important and obviously influential and intimately intertextual thing with Smith, conclusion of the first book of the treatise, where he also does that. That is to say, he frames what looks like a question, but it's with a period. And in fact, I think quite clearly there, you should actually not see it as a question, but it so much seems like a question that the Nortons, the modern editors of the treatise, have actually inserted a question mark there. So I do think that maybe this was some little device they had going. Now, there's just one or two things more I want to say. I'm sorry if I'm taking a little longer than I thought. And that is, yeah, two things. So one thing I want to say is that at the end of this remarkable footnote, he refers to God. First of all, he's channeling Plato. He's channeling Plato here. So he is sort of doing this as this is Plato's view. And then he says at the end, the great author of all things. But in Plato's view, the official Plato's view, which he's presenting, God wouldn't be the author of the metachlorians or the forms. So why is he saying the great author of all things? Two possibilities here would be he means, well, all things except those things that he's not the author of, which is a little kind of weird to interpret that way. And then the other thing could be that he's actually shifting from Plato, from channeling Plato to his own view of God, who is, properly understood, Plato got this wrong, the author of all things. So, but it's still, I find it quite striking that this remarkable footnote ends again with this kind of thing, something puzzling and maybe a hint. So there's one other thing I want to just briefly say, and that's Plato's second letter. Now, I don't know a lot about this. I don't know whether we really know that Plato wrote this, and I don't know whether Smith could have seen this, but in Plato's second letter, he's got this whole thing about being esoteric. And what's really notable is that he refers to himself in the third person. So if this was something available to Smith, that might have been, in this very kind of, actually, I'm very esoteric confession, a suggestion of like, hey, I'm going to actually use, rather than using the pronoun, I'm going to repeat Plato, and you can create a kind of esoteric statement that we talked about in the Aristotle superior to Plato claim. So again, there are three claims, just to sum up. In the footnote, I want to question all of them basically. There's the anti-esotericism proposition. That's the chief motivation of this whole matter. There's the anti-neo-Platonic Plato proposition. And there are little subtleties there where you might say he actually doesn't like the idea of, if the Neoplatonists say that God created the forms, maybe Smith doesn't like that, and he prefers to see a kind of interrelation between the forms and God's mind, and an interdependence like mother and child, but using the term created is not necessary. So he might actually, because I do think that the interrelation dependence is very Smithian and goes back to the organon and the whole spiral and non-foundationalism of Smith. And then there's the Aristotle greater than Plato proposition, which that I feel very strongly about, as like, that really doesn't make sense to me. All right, so those are my opening comments, and I'll stop screen and open it up. Nelson, do you want to jump in while you have time?
Sure. I think there's a lot of reason to give credence to your overall thesis that this is such an rhetorically outrageous and uncharacteristic passage in Smith that it's hard to believe that he means what he says here. In addition to that, I'm just going to go back a generation before Melzer to Strauss. And in one of his books, he says, when you come across a great thinker who's a careful writer, who says unbelievably stupid things that any schoolboy could see the flaw in the argument, it's a good idea to stop and ask yourself whether that must not mean something other than what he's actually saying. And that seems to apply here to what Smith is saying about Plato, because the one thing, the most obvious thing about Plato, and you don't have to read the second letter to know this, is Plato never says anything in his own name in the dialogues. And just attributing the things that are said by characters in the dialogues to Plato is a lot like characterizing the speeches of Macbeth as the voice of Shakespeare. Now, that's not quite the same, because Socrates is often taken as the spokesman for Plato. But then we have the odd thing that the Timaeus, which is mostly what Smith is talking about here, Socrates says almost nothing in that dialogue. So the idea that you just read everything that anybody says in Plato's dialogues as the voice of Plato is just so absurd on its face that it's hard to believe that Smith could just kind of pretend that he thinks that. So all of that I agree with, that we're creating a puzzle here. Smith is creating a puzzle for us that needs to be solved. Now, one thing I will say on your sentence about Aristotle being superior in everything but eloquence to Plato, I don't think that is likely. I don't think you're likely to be right about that for the following reason. Socrates, who you want to substitute in here as the teacher, was not, as far as I know, ever known for eloquence. He was known for quite the opposite. It's Plato who's really kind of the king of eloquence as far as the ancient philosophers go. The other thing is that Aristotle, in his published works, his published works, was known as a very eloquent writer. What we have are not his published works, but apparently documents that were somehow used within his school for the kind of the more initiated people. And they are written in a way that has allowed them to be taken as the authentic voice of Plato, of Aristotle, in part because they're not in the form of a dialogue, and in part because they weren't published. But that still leaves open the possibility that even among his own students in his school, Aristotle wrote to some degree esoterically. So the idea that one sentence, your interpretation of that one sentence seems quite implausible to me.
I really appreciate that. I want to quickly respond. First of all, go back to your earlier point. I appreciate your sort of reinforcement of, hey, something's going on here. And I just want to add that besides what you say about the Plato interpretations or interpreting Plato, the very statement at the beginning that chiefly concerns us about, hey, no one in his right mind wrote esoterically. The editors of this and just others are just like a lot of people scratch their head over that. That's it, like they're surprised to see Smith doing that, saying that, both because they recognize that Smith himself seems to sometimes do it, and that clearly other writers that he of course would know about he would recognize, I don't know who exactly, maybe, Thomas More's Utopia or all sorts of things that might be satirical or, esoteric, that there's just no way he could have thought that. So I think that's another big tip off that, hey, there's a schoolboy error here, as it were. The business on Plato and Aristotle, I'd like to, there's a lot more, that I could mount up here. It's a very strong statement, Nelson, to say that Aristotle is superior in everything except eloquence, given all the warmth and like, for example, in the lectures on rhetoric, he speaks of Plato's style is not so extravagant, that's his Lysias, but is at the same time too verbose, which is a little funny because that would mean that he's not so eloquent. which often conceal his other beauties. I mean, there's just so much warmth in many moments towards Plato that to say that Aristotle was superior in everything except one thing seems really strange. And as far as what he says about Aristotle, does he show a great warmth or super high regard? In fact, in this essay, he knocks Aristotle. He has a knock on Aristotle, and I think a pretty significant one, which I think, and while he does definitely give hat tips to Aristotle in TMS, particularly over the middle, the vice, virtue, vice formulation, and on the importance of habit and practice, there's no real expressions of some great warmth or admiration like you find repeatedly toward Plato. So those.
Yeah, I would just, the one thing I would say in response to that is, I don't deny that that sentence could be ironic and doesn't mean what it said. My hesitation is in accepting your alternative reading. I mean, the simpler form of irony would be just that he's saying something that would sound plausible to a lot of people, because Aristotle, the writings we have from Aristotle are not known for their eloquence in comparison with Plato. And there's certainly been a lot of people down through history who thought that
Okay.
there was a supposed great rift between Aristotle and Plato, and that Aristotle was the right one. And we have a whole medieval tradition that accepts that accepts Aristotle as practically all the wisdom that people are capable of without divine revelation, without the Christian revelation. So I think the sentence could just be ironic in a much more simple way than the one you suggested.
I see. So I'm sort of going further than I need to say there's some irony here. And
yes, right.
So it could be just a kind of, I'm only kidding esotericism when I say this thing.
Yes, right.
Okay. Others?
Professor Klein, you're still recording. You know that, right?
I do know that. Thank you, John.
Okay.
So I just wanted to follow up on that point that Nelson made. So do you have your own sense of why Smith would be doing this?
That's a great question. And I should have brought it up, at least to say that I don't have any quick answer to it. So now that you ask, well, I don't know what to say there. You know, I have this non-foundationalist, pragmatist tendency in my thought, which isn't terribly widely shared or popular. That tendency, I do think, is a tendency of these three essays, and I do think is a major theme of the first and major essay, the astronomy. I mean, this whole issue of what do we make of our conceptions and our ideas of grasping truth, I think is sort of like the major question of all of this, as wonder, surprise, and admiration prompt us. What is it that we're achieving in some other sense? But I guess my feeling is that this tendency is in human Smith strongly, that they never come out and kind of teach it directly, the way, say, you might say a William James or a Richard Rorty does, I guess. And why wouldn't they, if that's where they tended? There could be reasons. I mean, there could be cause for not doing that in their context, but I won't try to say more. What do you say, Bill?
Well, I was just going to observe that, you know, I'm not quite clear when these were written, but I sense from the apparatus around it that the ideas that they were written in the 1740s, which was before his appointment, at the university, and that he might have been reluctant to get sideways in some ways with received opinion at the university or in some other way with the Kirk, or I just don't know enough about the intellectual atmosphere at the time in Scotland to know, why he might need to be less than clear about his real opinion. So I was just wondering if that was where he was coming from, or if he just has other ideas that he's trying to express that I'm too dense to allow to penetrate. So
Right. I mean, those would be manifestations of the kind of concerns that, in some sense, which relate to this philosophical matter that I'm bringing up.
Professor Klein, I think one point strongly in your favor of an esoteric reading of this footnote is the fact that the footnote exists. Since we know Smith instructed his executors to destroy most of his materials except for a handful of things, which include these essays, which, if I recall correctly, he basically said or his will said to the executors, do what you feel is fit with these. So Smith must have thought that there was merit in these writings, one, to hold on to them for much of his life, and two, to not order their destruction, which makes a schoolboy error that Nelson was talking about all the weirder. The fact that Smith had these and did not order their destruction is, I think, a very interesting question that does point to either an ironic, well, definitely an ironic, but interesting reading of this footnote.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think there's probably, I like to think that there's more design and cunning, if you like, in these essays and the preservation of these essays than that story about Smith being kind of like, oh, there's some material here, you could do what you want with it. It could be that, he told Hutton and Black, look, I want you to present it this way when really this is very important to me and I want you to bring that. I mean, they could be lying too. They make it, they say, what they say at the opening of this is extremely brief. They have very little elaboration. You can see it here on page, page 32. And the original manuscripts of these essays and papers are lost. So it seems, I don't really know, but that would be consistent with Black and Hutton making a point of like destroying the original manuscript materials. Not that he would have necessarily written in his own hand anyway. So there's all this mystery just about sort of when things were written with these essays or things were added. So yeah, and it's not just this footnote, like the whole irony of the astronomy essay. That's really the one, like I say, the one moment of a progress of sentiment in Smith, of that sort of drama of inquiry as we go through the text, as Erik has pointed out in his great piece on the astronomy essay. So there's quite a bit. I think the stuff Andrew's done work on the external senses essay and how that parallels the impartial spectator in moral understanding. I think the imitative arts essay raises interesting questions about our imitating the divine and our whole existence of our whole entire life as a performance, an art or an artistic performance where we're trying to imitate something beautifully. And from a Christian point of view, I suppose that would be doing what Jesus would do. So yeah, I think there's very profound stuff going on in these essays.
Dan, could I interject here? This is Nelson.
Yeah.
I was skeptical about your interpretation of the question marks and the periods.
Hmm.
And I was going to ask you whether we know whether we've had the original manuscripts, and now you happen to mention that we don't, and that seems to me to throw a huge amount of doubt on your interpretation of the periods versus question marks, because it is so easy, even when when I'm writing myself, to write a question and put a period at the end of it. And sometimes I have to proofread something 3 or 4 times before I notice that I left the question mark off, because your eye just moves across the page. So even if we had the original manuscripts, it would be easily conceivable that Smith himself would have not noticed that he forgot to put a question mark instead of a period. But given that they had to have been copied at least once before they were published by somebody other than Smith, apparently, it seems to me that just throws a huge amount of doubt on the weight that you're putting on this small matter.
I can't dispute that. And the whole provenance of these materials is like so unclear that, things like that certainly could have happened between all of the passing of the cup, as it were. Again, Nelson, page 105, it's right there. The final, this ending of this essay, the astronomy, I'm sure he looked very, very carefully at this. And he ends with this question, which has a period. I don't know, I don't know what to say. I think there could be something to this. What's now something of there's a to make something of a pattern. Anyway, yeah, I don't know what else to say.
I have another few thoughts about this footnote, and not so much the motivation. Well, a question about the motivation. So he does talk some here about the Cambridge Platonists. The footnote is on this sentence, and the end of the sentence says that the view that Smith is taking issue with, Plato's view that Smith supports, the view that Smith reads in Plato, is controverted by the later Platonists and then by these very judicious modern critics, so the Cambridge Platonists. So it could be that Smith is trying to engage with or knock some of the Cambridge Platonists. I'm not sure why exactly he would have reason to do so. To take issue with Ralph Cudworth, for instance. But the other thing I thought of in this connection, I'm really not sure what the exact connection is. But so Shaftesbury was influenced by the Cambridge Platonists. I'm not exactly sure how closely. But one of the only other times in Smith's work where he gets this kind of agitated is in his lectures on rhetoric, when he digs into Shaftesbury for Shaftesbury's, style, basically. And Shaftesbury was very much a kind of esoteric dialogical writer. So I don't know what the kind of story is there, but there do seem to be some meaningful associations between at least Smith's kind of, spirit or mode, his tone in that passage in the lectures, and this footnote as well, and given the kind of association between Shaftesbury and the Cambridge Platonists. All that to say, I really have no idea what's going on here, but those are some angles that might be worth thinking about.
Indeed. You're quite right that there's peculiarity in his negative remarks about Shaftesbury in this, but of course this is student lecture notes, so that adds a whole layer of blurriness to how to interpret intentions and his expectations of anything being recorded or passed down to posterity. I wouldn't say, while people have remarked on the oddness of the remarks on Shaftesbury here, kind of him going out of his way to kind of come up with reasons to put down Shaftesbury, it seems. It's still not to anything like the degree of the outrageousness he's expressing here. the outrage he's expressing here. I would say.
Yeah, no, I follow. It's definitely similar in kind, but different in magnitude for sure. You're not really struck by, I mean, struck by his treatment of Shaftesbury, at least I am in a number of ways, because you think that he would admire Shaftesbury and have kind of warm regard for Shaftesbury because Shaftesbury was so influential to Hutcheson, and Hutcheson was such a big figure in Smith's personal life and intellectual development. And so it's kind of surprising in that sense that he would knock Shaftesbury. Just like you might be surprised here that he's kind of knocking the view put forward by the Cambridge Platonists, which is the view of the neo-Platonists. So
I don't think he's knocking their. I think he likes that view of the world and existence. It's just as a reading of Plato, right? As an interpretation of Plato.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's hard to tell. And I agree with you. I agree with you that he probably thinks of that view favorably, but here it's hard to tell whether or not he's saying this is, he is clearly saying this is a bad interpretation, a wrong-headed interpretation of Plato. There are moments when it seems like, well, he's just saying this is kind of a silly view in general.
I tend to read it more the other way, and that he more tends to align himself with the idea that the forms and the mind imply each other. There could be an objection to certain people's version of that if they put a lot of emphasis on A, creating B, which is a stronger claim in a way. So maybe there's where the difference would come, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anyhow, I think maybe I should turn this recording off because we do have other text. And so I'm going to turn this off now. Hang on. No. Wait, sorry. I almost did cancel the whole meeting. Okay, over here. Stop recording. Stop.